Welcome to Weaving Paths.
Bienvenido a Tejiendo Caminos.
Bem-vindos a Tecendo Caminhos,
a podcast brought to you by the EULAS Jean Monnet Network, which looks at the bi-regional relations between Latin America, the Caribbean, and the European Union. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you may be listening from. My name is Emily, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the EULAS Weaving Paths Podcast. In this episode, I'm joined by Professor Benedicte Bull from the Centre for Global Sustainability at the University of Oslo. Professor Bull has a distinguished career specialising in democracy, development and global governance, with a special focus on Latin America. She has led major academic initiatives such as the Oslo Academy of Global Governance and the Norwegian Latin America Research Network, and she currently chairs the Nordic Institute for Latin American Studies. Beyond her roles in Oslo, she collaborates with institutions across Europe and Latin America, from Salamanca to San Jose, and her research has shed light on the influence of elites, the political economy of Venezuela's collapse, and the growing role of China in the region, which we'll hear a little bit more about today. We actually met at the CELAC EU Doctoral Network Summer School here in Barcelona in September 2025, and she very kindly agreed to give up some of her time to speak with us today. In this conversation, we'll dive into her work on the rebirth of the Global South, EU-Latin American cooperation, and the challenges of mediation and peacebuilding. So let's get into it. Welcome to the show, Benedicte.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
So let's start with the big picture for our listeners. In your recent work on the rebirth of the Global South, which we will link to in the podcast description, you show how shifting power balances are reshaping development and democracy. How do these changes affect the potential for EU-Latin American cooperation?
Well, I think it's a real challenging context, of course, because there's so many things that are ongoing, and we're, as academics, we're struggling with sort of describing what kind of global situation we are in, and none of us are able to do that because we are in such a transition and a power struggle over how to define the parameters, how to define global governance, what does it consist of, how to define the multilateral system, and also sort of how to define groups of countries. And we've discussed a bit this morning, actually, sort of the use of the term the Global South, also because it's used a lot now from Latin American researchers, that they refer to their part of the Global South, and then sort of implicating that there is a distinction between Global South and Global North, and that is kind of the major power relations in the world, which re-emphasizes the difference between Latin America and Europe. Well, but there's also many other ways of looking at it, and the question comes up: sort of, what is the goal? So what's then the global north? Is China the global south? They would argue they're the center of the global south, but if they are also the in group with Latin America, what then about sort of the whole idea of active non-alignment, for example, that many Latin American intellectuals, I mean, it's not like the majority, but it's one kind of current of thought, is that that should make Latin America non-aligned from China, from the US. Should it also be non-aligned from Europe? Or is this more kind of someone that you would look at in a more kind of solidarity perspective? So I think these concepts are confusing, but they're also defining the agenda. And it's a challenge for Europe to place itself in that perspective, because it's not the most powerful region or country in the world anymore, and it's quite a few years since it was. But it also is not included in sort of the groups of countries that Latin America wants to be defined within. So that leaves, it's kind of, you see that as a debate that goes through a lot of the different discussions we've had here. We're now in Barcelona at a PhD course in the EULAC network, but also been in other discussions about the EU Latin America relationship. So, yeah, I would like this relationship to be more defined by solidarity, but I think this notion of North and South creates this kind of very hardcore distinction. that makes it harder to re-establish a relationship.
Yeah, totally. The north-south divide is problematic because it's far too simplistic to reduce the world into just two blocks. And yeah, very interesting then to hear how confusing that is with regards to how Europe and Latin America are not only seen but wish to be seen and wish to position themselves, and how they can create partnerships from that. Do European and Latin American approaches to democracy and mediation align at all, or do they clash, especially when facing authoritarian models? I'm thinking of your research in particular on Venezuela and the influence of external powers like China. Perhaps you can talk to us a bit about that.
The common answer to that would be that it weakens the EU's possibility. It can't impose its values and its ideas of human rights and democracy, because the countries can go somewhere else to get loans or investments or whatnot. So they have no kind of leverage. I'm not sure if I agree with that view, and I think that it's also ironically a view that I think is underlying a lot of Europe's own policies now. Now we're going to go back in there, we're going to put some money, have some money available, we're going to re-emphasize our values. I actually don't think the EU was ever able to impose its values. I think the sort of drive for democracy comes it is a kind of interchange of ideas, of course, but I think it comes equally from within the region, and that's proven so many times over. And I think that even now, where you see the process of so-called democratic backsliding, authoritarian governments rising, if you look finally at what people say in polls and different research, there is such a drive for democracy. They're really unhappy with the state of their own democracies. They would maybe sometimes renounce some democratic rights in order to survive, to have public safety, to be able to go out in the street, not being killed or robbed. But I think it's very difficult to say that there is not a kind of internal drive for democracy in most of those countries. So this was a long way around the answer, but I was actually asked just to have another little sidestep here. My PhD was on privatization in Central America, and my hypothesis was, of course, it was the 90s, and all sort of European engaged young people. We thought that the World Bank and the IMF was behind everything. They were imposing the privatization, imposing all sorts of stuff on Latin America. And I started to look at this in Central America, comparative study of Central American countries, and it was not really the case that they were imposing things. They were able to sort of support some internal actors that then got more power to influence the agenda. But even in a country like Honduras, I mean, you would think that this is the sort of prime case dependent country where the US can dictate everything. But look at the agendas. It was not really like that. Yeah, there were some influence. They were trying to do something, but the ones that were really pushing the agenda was local businessmen that tried to buy the privatized companies, and they were shaping the laws so that it would benefit them. And I think that's a kind of that's a lesson that I've brought with me for the rest of my career. That also looking at how China is influencing Latin America. No, it's not like they're imposing their authoritarian system. They also say they don't, but I think even if they wanted, it doesn't work that way. It works in the way that they strengthen some actors that have some inclinations and some agendas, and others not. And I think that's the same with the EU. The EU has influenced agendas, of course, through what we're involved in here, education, and through many other ways. But it's always through strengthening some domestic actors and maybe weakening others. And now, the EU has maybe less influence in some contexts, but it doesn't matter that all. It doesn't mean that all the actors that are trying to strengthen democracy are disappearing, although they might have lost governmental power in a country. Yeah, right. I think that is always important to remember when you have get an authoritarian government. So yeah, there's different degrees here. I would say, for example, a country like Nicaragua, the democratic actors are so weak now and so exiled or imprisoned or whatnot. So it's hard to think of who to strengthen, and the same is probably not be coming through in Venezuela, but I think in most countries there are still a lot of connections. So, and I also think that I'm not sure if it's the right way to coin things, sort of we have to sort of stand up and compete with China. I think the EU should do what the EU is good at and continue with that.
Absolutely. That's such an interesting point. It really isn't a one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to shaping political or regional agendas. So it's much more about finding the specific avenues where an actor can exert influence, like through education, as Europe does. Yes, it was also lovely to hear a bit more about your PhD. I'll definitely make a note to look that up later. So, thinking more about your current research, you have looked into how elites dominate the politics and the economy in Latin America. Europe and the form of liberal democracy that Europe is promoting is sometimes accused of being elitist and even exacerbating inequalities. What do you see as the main challenges to that, and how can Europe collaborate with Latin America on the challenges of income concentration and inequality?
Yeah, I think actually the Europe has a lot to contribute with that there, and I mean, the kind of model that Europe has promoted is it's a capitalist economy, and it has and with kind of liberal democracy, but I mean there's different varieties of that. The typical liberal democracy of Europe is a sort of social democratic system where you have kind of the democracy is supposed to govern everything, and you have a capitalist economy, but there's also spheres and spaces that are taken out of the capitalist economy, like depending on the country, but it could be the health service, the education sector. It's not running on capitalist principles because it's seen as basic rights at something. And so I think it is a kind of mixed model, but it's also true that we live currently in a capitalist economy, all of us, that's generating and it's sort of a scary concentration of income. And I actually think the EU is among the very, very few actors in the world that can to some extent not stop, but at least put a little bit of a break on that process. It has tried through promoting a wealth tax, which is also a proposal that has come out of Brazil. And I think the EU should portray itself or sort of emphasize that more also in the relationship with Latin America, because most Latin Americans are very, very well that their country is not only governed by democratic institutions, not only governed by as it used to be sort of the US, but also by their own elites and increasingly by global elites. I just did a little tiny study. It's just not a major study, but I want to look more into this on the sort of the changing face of Latin American oligarchs. It's going to come out in the European review of Latin American and Caribbean studies shortly, and looking at the richest people in Latin America, who they are and who they were, and there is a notable change. And the new kind of rich people are, it's surprise, surprise, those that are linked to the digital economy and digital finance, and they're very much connected to other global groups. I mean, the founder of Facebook, for example, is Brazilian. He doesn't necessarily care too much about Brazilian politics for the moment, but you have others that are kind of so there is a change here. And at the same time, you see that the local oligarchs are becoming more and more dependent on the global oligarchs. So it's kind of this dependency theory all over again, but just with a very different twist. And I think that this power concentration is extremely anti-democratic at the end of the day, and a single country just cannot stand up to that. And the only actor I see in the world that's willing to do it is the EU. So I think here you have a very, I mean, it's an agenda that Brazil has tried to raise, and I'm sure there's other countries in Latin America that would have liked to do it. It's just that they don't have the muscles to do so.
So high pressure on the EU to use the muscle they have then. And well, it will be very interesting to read your think piece on those, the Latin American oligarchs when that comes out. We'll be sure to add that to the description of this podcast for interested listeners as well. Talking a little bit more about how Europe and Latin America can cooperate despite their differences in how they might balance sovereignty and human rights and democratic values, how do you think the two regions can find common ground when they work together on democracy and mediation?
I think it's the obvious thing to start with is that Latin American countries and European countries are so different internally at the moment. I mean, you have everything from El Salvador to the current Chilean government, and Mexico to so many different concerns. But I think that, again, sort of defending sovereignty is an interesting joint agenda. I mean, this is core interests of both of the countries of both regions. I mean, and for a very obvious reason, which is the Trump administration's threat against sovereignty. I mean, you had Panama, you now have Venezuela with the military buildup in the Caribbean and the attacks on different supposed drug boats. And in Europe, of course, the issue of Greenland, where I come from in Norway, we are extremely concerned about Svalbard, which is a part of Norway, but it's also kind of vulnerable. It's an island very far away, and it's if you want to take Greenland, next step is Svalbard, and then that is Norwegian territory. So I think that this kind of defense of sovereignty is definitely a joint agenda for Latin America and Europe, and also sort of sharing experiences with how to kind of defend basic rights also for countries, sovereignty, but also trading systems and all that we know of. And for now, it appears that most countries are trying to find their own ways, fending for themselves, and that's probably the only way to go about things for a country like Mexico, which is just in an extremely vulnerable situation at the moment. But I think there is some common ground to find here, sort of between Europe and Latin America, and it's an obvious. It is an obvious alliance if you're thinking that of upholding multilateral. Basic multilateral system. I mean, multilateralism grows out of the first norm that is emerging is sovereignty. And that is what it's all built on. So, there's different ways. Some are now trying to sort of cater more, trying to avoid being in the in the shooting line of Trump. And there's all sorts of strategies, but I think that maybe when things calm down a little bit, there would be ground for thinking how to confront this in a joint manner. Because I also think that, I mean, if Trump was serious about really taking on China, if that were the main thinking, he should have created a strong alliance with Europe and with Latin America. Instead, he's creating enemies all over the place. But then it could be Europe's role to create those alliances. And I also think in that respect, it would be a good idea for Europe not to just uncritically adopt the anti-China discourse of the US that you often hear also from European officials. It's an extremely complicated matter. I'm concerned with China for a different reason than the US, and that is the sort of good old. My background is from development theory, And it's so obvious that China has industrialized to a level that makes it impossible for most other countries to industrialize at the moment. They might portray themselves as a development partner for Latin America. They invest in infrastructure and they trade, etc. But it is based on Latin America's export on raw materials, and I just don't see that there is a space for Latin America to develop in terms of industry in a close relationship with Latin America, and that probably also goes for Europe. So we're kind of a little bit in the same boat. So that I'm very concerned about, but I think it's a mistake to sort of adopt this extreme anti-China rhetoric that you've heard also from some European officials.
And quite frankly, we have quite enough extreme rhetoric in the world right now. So at the institutional level, what forms of cooperation between the EU, CELAC or national governments could best strengthen transatlantic action or mediation and peace building?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting opportunity that comes up, this EU-CELAC meeting. And those summits are important, of course, but they sometimes end up with a nice photo and not much more. So I think it would be important to kind of strengthen this alliance at a more institutional level, and especially I'm thinking of a sort of a democracy alliance. It's not like that's a totally new idea. We have more of it, but. Now they were launching 2 new sort of alliances on the care economy and on drugs and crime, and I think those are really, really important. But I think there could be one on strengthening democratic ties and to work consistently with the democratic actors in the region. And those are under threat, and from the perspective that the democratic actors are under threat in both regions to a large extent. And also that there's some extremely, we still have a little tendency, maybe I'm from Norway and we're not better than anyone else, but maybe we have this kind of a little bit more of humility. Well, not necessarily. Yeah. I'm sort of chewing my words here because at least when we compare each other, we're compared to the EU, because the EU still tends to think that we are the sort of champions of democracy in the world, and sort of we really need to take in that our democracies are also under threat, and we have lots of really undemocratic forces within our borders, and that there's also extremely interesting examples of how to defend democracy in other regions. And Brazil is the obvious case to look to at the moment that has done that to a level that's much more impressive than not any of the European countries can showcase at the moment. So sort of a kind of an alliance that is really based on common concerns and not on that the problems are in one region and not the others, not the other. And I think democracy is a perfect topic for that, because if you look at, for example, the sort of drug economy and all that, it is an attempt to take really the concerns of Latin Americans seriously, but Europe and Latin America are in a very kind of unequal relationship there, because the concern with Europe is the flow of cocaine that's coming, or a flow of other substances or whatever. So it is sort of an unequal starting point. So I think that would be something that I would like to see, and something that could be more institutionalized. That's always really complicated in international politics, but if you ask me to sort of just dream up something, it would be that.
It's a hard question to end with. Well, thank you very, very much for your time, Benedicte, for your expertise. We've loved hearing from you. Thank you from the EULAS Network. Thanks for listening. If you liked what you heard today, check out all of our episodes available on SoundCloud, Spotify and YouTube. We have episodes in English, Spanish and Portuguese. Or follow us online. We would love to hear from you. We're on X, Blue Sky, LinkedIn and Instagram. head to www.eulas.network to find out more. Thank you. Gracias. Obrigada.